Good afternoon. It is a little afternoon on June 24th, 2021. I understand that the topic for consideration at this point in time is torture, including the torture concerning people that have been in under conditions of detention or imprisonment. I am not at this time going to speak specifically about the legalities of the detention itself, but I am going to speak about my research and understanding as well as personal experience with being subjected to what legally constitutes torture and what the understanding I have is of its material relevance to the time frame we're in at this point, as well as the potential implications moving forward. We'll start by saying that my first experience with this was as a journalist in Chicago. At the time, I was actually a managing editor of a newspaper. One of the reporters who worked on the staff came to me with a story idea. It had concerned a meeting he had attended where there had been discussion about a man who had been kidnapped out of his house in the area and had been taken into a secret detention by the FBI. He had been denied any sort of access to or from his family. He had been denied a lawyer. As a matter of fact, at the time, they did not know where he understood that they did not know where he'd been held during the time frame, and he was concerned that what he was hearing about was actually a form of torture. He was somebody who had previous experience in the United States military. He was a Vietnam War veteran, and while the matters he was talking about sounded a bit extreme, I took him seriously and I began doing investigation myself. There was a article that was written in both our names. It was called Terror and Torture on Trial in Chicago. If I am correct, it was published in either the late summer or early fall of either 1999 or between 1999 and 2001. Now, at this time, I have not been able to obtain a copy of that article for myself, and I cannot find any evidence of it, and have not been able to for the last 5 years. For the previous 10 years to that, I had not looked for it, even though in 2009 I did see a issue, the actual paper issue of that publication that the article was published in as part of an archive of one of the journalists who I worked for or worked with. And in the course of working with her, she had an archive of the papers that we had worked on together. And that specific issue was in her archive at the time in 2009. But since that time, I have not seen that article and I have not seen any other information specifically about that story. I have seen an article online in a digital publication that I believe plagiarized that article. As a matter of fact, I think there are 3 paragraphs that I specifically wrote in that article detailing a specific sequence of events and was verbatim lifted with maybe very minor changes and inserted into another article that completely recontextualized the case. At the time that the specific story was presented, the topic of the story was an individual man who was Palestinian, who was in the United States after having been arrested in Israel and subjected to what was identified and determined to be torture enough for the confession that was coerced out of him to be rendered inadmissible as evidence in Israel. Once he got to the United States, however, part of the article described how the trial that was occurring in the United States used that confession that had been obtained in Israel under circumstances identified as torture for evidence in the trial in the United States. And I had seen how elements of the article that I had written with Rayford Allen had been lifted out of the original context and put into another context that described events within a series of events involving somebody allegedly from Saudi Arabia that was laundering money through a charity, including a religious-based charity in the state of Virginia. At the time and prior to me leaving the newspaper in early 2002, there was no information and no reference points or associations between the trial of Mohammed Salah and anybody from Saudi Arabia. This had not come up, and if there was evidence or information revealed later as part of other investigations, that was not what had been about the original investigation. and the original article. In the article, it was described how at the time there were a number of organizations in Israel, including Palestinian Israeli organizations, but also Israeli organizations that were working with people who had alleged they'd been tortured while they had been detained by the Shin Bet. In the article, I also attempted to contact members of the Israeli consulate in the United States. Their response is reflected in the article. The primary information came from reports that were provided by two Israeli NGOs. I remember the names of at least one of them. And in the report, they actually had a detailed report, including it having illustrations that describe the specific techniques that were used. And specifically, this included sleep deprivation. It included being subjected to loud music, including for protracted periods of time. And it also described being positioned in a specific posture involving a kind of furniture that was not conventional, and having these kinds of sequences rotated while also being subjected to instances of interrogation, and then the specific sequencing of the actual interrogation process was described, at least in part, in that article. Now, there was a specific word that was associated with this specific technique. It was called shaba. And the understanding is that the reference to the name had to do with the fact that as part of these torture tactics, one of the things that would happen is somebody would be physically touched and shook, and that the shaking had implications. The long-term implications are something that I'm certain somebody else can speak to, but at the time, the understanding is that it had to do with these matters that were occurring at the time. This is the best of my recollection in terms of that article. As I've said, I have not read that specific article since at least 2003. But I remember it very vividly, and there are specific sequences that I wrote that I also remember. The course of writing it was somewhat traumatizing because it was very difficult. It was very visual in terms of the description of the information and the representation of the actual tactics or the techniques that were identified. But as the trial progressed, and as information became available about how it was not an isolated incident, and specifically the consideration of the fact that the confession that had been coerced under what was identified and acknowledged as torture had been thrown out as evidence in Israel. And that was part of how it was understood that Mr. Salah was able to come to the United States and inform the context for his livelihood in the United States. And yet, after the FBI raided his home, after he was kidnapped, or as they would say, I don't remember this term they used at the time, but he was detained. And there was some justification for the detention being kept secret that I understood had to do with, first, an executive action taken under the Clinton administration designating new terrorist organizations, but also in accordance with the implementation of elements of the 1996 Anti-Terrorist and Effective Death Penalty Act. And that the detention was being used in a manner to try to justify the the permissibility for it being kept secret while he was denied any representation by his attorney. But the crucial issue was, if even in Israel they're going to throw this confession out as evidence because it's identified as being obtained through coercion that legally constitutes it being excluded, then why would the United States be able to then use it as evidence in a proceeding that was ongoing in the United States, specific to acts that allegedly occurred in the United States that were covered under changes to the law that were made after the actual event of concern? These were the major issues that were presented. But the major, concern at the time was, what was the implication? As something had been determined to be inadmissible because it legally constituted torture. And now we're in a situation where there's other allegations, including other allegations that are occurring in a context of other claims that are unsubstantiated. And yet that evidence that had been excluded because it had been identified to be evidence of torture was now being used against the person who was being accused of new crimes. This was my understanding of the context of that specific article. It was called Terror and Torture on Trial in Chicago by Charity Krause and Rayford Allen, and it was printed in Streetwise newspaper. Now, after this, I ended up leaving the paper. I did some travel to the Middle East. My original intention was to talk to people who had experience with syndicates connected to trafficking of human beings, specifically from the former Soviet Union to the United States or to and through and within Israel. This was part of other investigations I had been doing as a newspaper editor. And one of the things that had been coming up in my discussions with people that were in various nonprofit networks or that were in reports that I was reading was that there had been changes to laws in Israel with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that what was happening is people were leaving the former Soviet Union, the countries of the former Soviet Union, sometimes under assumed identities and sometimes not. And that there was a proliferation of foreign based or foreign origin prostitution in Israel that was not isolated and left in Israel. And that what was happening is people were going to or through Israel as well as other countries. And then were ending up in other parts of the world where they were being subjected to processes of compelled prostitution. And understanding was by and large the people this focused on were women. It was by and large women of a certain age. And that my interest was in trying to talk with feminist organizations or women's organizations specifically, but also organizations that dealt with issues related to prostitution and sex trafficking in Israel to see what they were doing about this and how it was impacting them there, with a hope that that would provide a means by which to address it in the United States. But I am not unaware of, and I was not lacking an understanding that the relationship between prostitution and sex trafficking is very significant in connection with the proliferation of war and the proliferation of violence, including state violence. And so I'd also gone to the Middle East with a hope and an intention, possibly to meet with people that were in a situation where they were a part of a political movement that existed at the time that was identified as the Refuseniks, which were people that were coming of their mandatory military service age in Israel, but were refusing for a variety of reasons, a variety of different reasons, not all of which were about conscientious objector status to serve their military service requirements in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, specifically the West Bank. So this was my intention to go there when I went to the Middle East. But after taking a originally unscheduled trip to Honduras first, where I filled in for somebody who had been requested to assist with the development of the basic instruction and setup of a low power FM radio station for people that were part of a political movement in Honduras. I did ended up going to the Middle East, and when I got there, the facts in effect at the time really changed the trajectory of what I had originally hoped and planned to do. There were military incursions that were happening in areas within the West Bank, and at that time, I was one of few American journalists that were in the area. So I was requested to come and to participate in observation, but not even observation, rather reporting and coverage of incidents that happened. So I did both attempts to communicate with people in Israel as well as ended up traveling to the West Bank. At the time, there was nothing illegal about an American citizen traveling to the West Bank. There was a different situation for one that was Israeli, but for Americans, there was nothing illegal. I went through the checkpoints and I did what I needed to do in that regard. To this day, nobody has ever approached me with any accusations that anything I did there was illegal or that would have violated international law. And so in the course of that, I ended up traveling to a variety of places, including one place that I understood at the time had been put into a situation where official medical personnel had been allowed, and that there was a time frame in which people had not been allowed and had been cut off altogether. There were a number of checkpoints that would be erected at various places. The actual process of getting through the checkpoints it was arbitrary, sometimes not. But the point I'm making is that while I was there, I was also able to speak with people and talked about their experiences. And new information came to light, including information that was incredibly contested and has been contested to this day. And that I understand, as a result, in the last 20 years, some people contend may not have been accurately relayed. It may actually have been a part of an attempt to try to create false narratives with the intention of engaging in acts of long-term political sabotage. So I can only really comment on what I got with an understanding of its presentation within the context of me identifying myself as a professional journalist and letting people know that I was going to be putting what they said to me on the record. Now, I did have a time frame in which I met with members of the Palestinian Authority at a time when it was understood that there had been a threat of besiegement by the Israeli Defense Forces. And so I did spend some time in Ramallah, in the Palestinian compound, where I did have an opportunity to speak with people that were official representatives of the Palestinian Authority. I also spoke with somebody who was independent, but was connected to a Palestinian NGO that worked specifically with women and women's rights. And while I was in Israel, I also spoke with Israeli activists from a variety of different sectors, including somebody that was in charge of a feminist NGO or a feminist organization in Israel, as well as somebody that at the time was in charge of or connected to the leadership of an LGBT organization in Israel. I have information that, unlike the work I did when I was a newspaper editor at Streetwise, is on the public record. And there has been some problems with this because I contend that at least one of the articles I wrote has actually been used in acts of torture. I wrote an article for the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Review. That's what it was identified as at the time. I submitted an article to the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Review in 2002. After a period of time, they let me know they were going to publish it. I remember upon the first reading that I had thought that there was some heavy editing in certain areas that I did not agree with on one hand, but on the other hand, I did not dispute at the time, except that there was a specific manner in which things that I had actually put into the context of the article had been footnoted as opposed to being put in the narrative of the article, and this made it a very different structural consideration. But and at another time, I ended up doing a public speaking event at the Art Institute of Chicago about that very article, where I was a presenter along with a man who had identified himself as being a representative of an Israeli organization and who himself was from Israel. And during that time frame, there was some disputation of information in that article, but the only thing he disputed was the numbers. He did not dispute any of the actual facts as they were presented in the article. His dispute was about the specific numbers of people that were being referenced. And my understanding is that when that happened, something happened to me physically that had never happened before. That in the course of his oral presentation, I experienced a form of biophysiological response, and that I had not ever encountered that specific thing before. But I heard that as he was disputing the numbers of people impacted in the article, it was as if the energy field around my body changed and things ended up becoming highly charged. And this was the first time I'd ever encountered that. I had not even encountered that while I was actually in the Middle East. But this has been something that I've been very conscious of in a very specific way for ever since. That the contestation was not about the facts. It was not about whether or not this had actually happened. It was not about whether or not these people had actually done it. It was about the number. Well, I don't think it was as many people as you say it was. This is how it was recounted, and this is the way I was supposed to remember it. As if the situation here is something very, pay attention to the numbers. And it was a very alarming situation for me because I had met with him beforehand. We had had a conversation beforehand, before the presentation. And then when he got onto stage, it was as if it was a specific choreographed performance that was meant to recalibrate the context based upon the argumentation with the metrics that were mentioned in the article. If I recall correctly, this presentation was done either in late 2002 or early 2003. It was in Chicago at the and sponsored by either the Art Institute specifically or an organization affiliated with the Art Institute of Chicago. I mentioned this because I believe that that was indicative of a kind of process that has been in development since. And that is actually part of a process that is a form of a nascent process of what is actually a form of electronic torture. And that the manners in which it is effectuated is not just about interfering with the physical processes based on augmentation of or manipulation of radio frequency, It's also based upon a triggering of implanted verbal cues that, with the changing and the alteration of the radio frequency, are then supposed to be able to trigger, including very visual sequences, but some sort of programmatic regime aimed at uh, contextualizing a fear response or an effort to try to compel somebody to escalate their behavior, including in a violent manner that may excitate a reaction, which itself may be programmed or may be a part of a series of tactics that somebody specifically trained would already have been alerted to. I also understand it's part of what is some context is identified as somebody's patented technology. That they've actually tested these processes, including in a variety of forums, such as that public speaking event. And somebody decided they would take the results of that, including any recordings that were done, and that specific presentation was recorded. And they were going to copyright it or patent it, and then they were going to take it out of the public realm, and then they were going to use it in the development of product lines that they were going to use to engage in acts of torture, including acts of clandestine torture that were not meant to be demonstrably evident or were not meant to be able to be verifiably identified as what would legally constitute torture. And that what's been happening is that while there are weaponization components of these specific kinds of technology outrolls, specifically the ones about manipulation of radio frequency and the pre-programmed sequences related to verbal cues that have been implanted unconsciously and can manifest or attempt to manifest a response when they are triggered through somebody's discussion or encounter, that they also have been attenuated into other derivative product lines from the original weaponizations, and that some of them are attempted to be used as part of the outroll of the digital economy and have been justified as some form of telemedication. This understanding of impacting the ionization of the area or allowing for some sort of radio frequency alteration, including through a electronic device like a cell phone. And depending upon the individual and what has been programmed into the background of that individual at the time that radio frequency trigger ends up coming through, that it can excitate a response, including an escalation into violence, including triggering people's adrenaline glands and or even altering their serotonin levels, including to induce hallucinations. But even if the hallucinations themselves are not induced, it can also, as I've been experiencing more and more, especially in the last 4 years, it can actually attempt to alter somebody's consciousness so that they are in a course of recitation of pre-programmed verbal sequences, i.e., you go to talk to somebody and you think you're talking about something, but when you open your mouth, something comes out very different from what you thought. And I think that this is also a form of torture that has been applied on a very massive scale in order to compel people to cede in actual accountability, but also in actual cognizant engagement with an understanding that if they just relent, then there will be an attenuation to what is being directed at them personally, so that they will be removed from physical pain, or they will be disengaged from some sort of actual duress, including psychological duress that is accompanying these directed energy targets, and that if they just say what comes out and they don't question it, then they're going to be able to do what they need to do to get through. And I think, and I've experienced this several times myself, at least twice. I've actually had this happen to me, where I've attempted to speak on something that I'm thinking about, and as I open my mouth, I'm saying something completely different than what I'm thinking. And what I did at that time is I actually went and tried to see if I could track down what the underlying event was that was actually financing. And when I did that, I was able to recalibrate some things so that it disengaged the control mechanism. And I believe that this is part of what they've been doing. That they've been using a certain kind of so-called security, including an underwriting process, to try to program people to actually verbally recite something that has already been scripted for them. And I think that this has been unrolling, and as this has been rolling out, that it's not just about verbal recitation. It's also about actually neuro programming people and impacting them psycho emotionally in order to be excitated into states of rage and or being excitated into performance of acts of violence and altering their hormone levels so that they can actually have the stamina to continue even if they're being subjected to pain or even if they're being brutalized in the moment. Now, these are things that, if I were able to, I could present certain aspects that I understand are actually evidentiary. I believe, for instance, that I have identified a series of patents that have been issued as a continuing refinement of a particular patent process associated with a specific kind of lethal technique that targets the heart area in order to remotely trigger what is supposed to appear as a heart attack when it is no such thing. It is a directed energy weapon that targets the heart in such a manner as to excitate someone or over stimulate somebody in a manner that actually results in what somebody tries to medically classify as a heart attack. This technique has been around for a long time. And I personally was used in the development of this technique that I was conscious of beginning in 2008 after the 2008 election. Prior to that, I was involved with various things. I was doing a variety of kinds of energy work. But it wasn't presented to me as potentially being connected to a process of offensive engagement until after I had been subjected to a process of trying to attack me aurically, and specifically my chakra areas. And then I was cognizantly and consciously trying to engage with what I understood could be some sort of defense against being attacked in my chakra system. And what I did not know is that I was being remotely monitored as part of what appears to now be a long term outlay process connected to various weapons development paradigms. And so they were actually using me as a test subject in order to refine that methodology into weaponizational moments. And this is what they've been doing ever since. So I was conscious of this. I just want to let you know. I was conscious that I was being subjected to some form of torture, attempting to use my body against me, and that I was attempting to cultivate or develop a means or mechanism by which to protect myself. As soon as I would say November, December of 2008. Prior to that, I believed I was doing energy work, I was studying a martial art, but I didn't touch anybody. Nobody touched me. So this was something I understood was just me training or me doing meditation. But then when the infrasonic information started to increase, and then when I was able to consciously engage with bandwidth that was having determinations and that were discussing policies for a very long period of time, well, I started to get it was a difficult time frame in some regards because on one hand it sounded like it was coming from a particular kind of consciousness, a particular kind of conscious stream with a certain element of calculation and premeditation, and it was interfering with other sorts of encounters I was having where I was actually engaged in some work of energy and energy development and engaging energetically. Because I had nobody in my realm, and at the time I was around a lot of people, but nobody in my realm, nobody within the actual context of the environment I was in at any level, would acknowledge that they were conscious of the communication streams I was engaged with. I did not have any confirmation that what I was dealing with within my head without speaking was something that anybody else that was either alive or honestly based within my actual geographic area was participating in. I knew it was more than just me talking to myself, and it wasn't just voices in my head because I was mentally ill, primarily because these sequences of information that I would be processing would actually manifest in events, including events that would be reported on in the news, but also events that occurred in my immediate environment. So I knew there was more causal factor in that. But the determination about at what point you're doing some sort of self exploration or you're encountering consciousness and engaging with that consciousness for development, including for people that have special sensitivity or special skills, and then at what point it ends up becoming a torture, is a very important question for right now, especially when there are protracted processes of giving intentionally orchestrated misinformation in order to force you to admit to a false claim, which is that I don't know what this is. This isn't this, this isn't this, this isn't this. What did you say it was? Oh, okay. So it's okay. So what am I allowed to say it is so that you will reduce the pain? And this is exactly what I experienced in March of 2010. By March of 2010, I was being subjected to some form of directed energy. And I didn't call it directed energy. I called it vibrational energy. And it was a vibrational energy that also had visualization. And the kind of visualization, which I didn't know how to explain at the time, involved, for instance, I was meditating, and while I was meditating, I get something that appears as this horribly racist cartoon. But there's a specific things that are said, and there's a specific layout involving an actual room. And then about an hour later, I get online, and at the time, or maybe at or immediately before the time I was meditating, I received an email from somewhere. I had never gotten an email before. And the email said it was from the election campaign of Barack Obama, and it was a follow-up in preparation for maintaining activities. The things that were mentioned in that specific email were directly connected to the visualizations I had while I was meditating. Now, I did not at the time, for instance, have the cognizance to try to look in the back-end coding to see if I could actually find some form of line of code as an implant. But I had been having events like that occur for up to a year. This was the first time I was able to actually directly coordinate and identify the specific time frame where I got the actual visual stream of information that also appeared to be an enticement or an effort to get me to agree to something that was referred to via some sort of derivative kind of coded messaging in the email. But then when I saw that, then the vibrational energy I was subjected to began to increase. And at a certain point in time, it got so painful and so tortuous. And the various aspects that were going on at that time became so significant that at the time what I did is I called my pastor and I asked my pastor if he could help me. My hope was that he was going to take me out of the city and we were going to go somewhere remote where there wasn't any electricity. And that I was going to be able to go to the woods for a while without any electricity around me. And I was going to be able to ground myself in nature, and I was going to be able to start putting things together and then from there figure out what to do. Well, that's not what happened. He said, I think you need to go to the PES. I didn't know what that was at the time. He said, I think you need to go to the hospital. They'll help you, and then we'll take it from there. I didn't want to go to the hospital, but at the time I was in so much pain, and I trusted him. So I went to the hospital, and then things ended up going the way they did. Because I went to the hospital, I was there for 3 days. I went to a program that was supposed to be for 2 months to help me adjust. They gave me medication. I took the medication. When the pain relented, I left the program. I was like, okay, now that the pain is done, and now I can sleep. Because I hadn't been sleeping for days. I didn't sleep for maybe 3 weeks at all before I ended up going there. I didn't have a proper night's of sleep. But once I left, I went back to the indoor arrangement I had, and then it became even more intense. It became even more intense and became more violent. And I had to go back. So they'd given me a card. They gave me the card. I called. I went back, and I stayed for the duration of the program that time, which was several months long. It was a 3-month indoor residential program. Now, I mentioned this because the question would be, well, at what point did it become torture? And the question also then becomes, and if it was torture, did it ever stop? Since I have been in Texas, I have found information about how at the very time I was trying to deal with these electronic messages that were coming into my email, as well as the things I was experiencing real time, that they were actually doing demonstrations on directed energy weapons for academic programs here in Texas, including in Dallas. I have a brochure in my evidence. They were doing several demonstrations and tests of directed energy weapons, explicitly. Now, I started finding this information once I got to Dallas. So it is not as if when I walk into an emergency room at a hospital and I say, I am being subjected to some sort of energy It's vibrational energy. It's trying to get me to say I committed crimes I never committed and wants me to agree to commit to crimes in the future. Well, no, no, no. You have a chemical imbalance. You have a history of mental illness. No, that's not what this is. I can hear them. I end up seeing things, then they appear on the news. Somebody is sending me vibrational energies trying to get me to agree that I committed crimes I never committed. And they want me to agree to commit other crimes. You have a chemical imbalance. We're going to give you some medication in order to, and then we're going to get you into a program to stabilize. And they kept saying the same thing over and over again. We're not going to listen to any other explanation you try to give us. This is what we're going to do. And if you're having a hallucination, you can go speak to the counselor. And that's what they did for several months. Now, does this legally qualify as torture? Well, this is what is going to be coming out. This is what we're going to be discussing. And this is what is going to have to be attended to. Because what I did not know, what nobody told me, again, for the second time in my life, and almost at exactly a very important strategic time frame. Let's see, the case regarding women in American military, all-male military academies came out when? 2006? No, I'm sorry, 1996? So in 2011, 15 years later, the Supreme Court of the United States is considering and ruling on a case allegedly about state secrets. See, it would be different if I hadn't found the case exactly 20 years before that regarding freedom of information, right? The Freedom of Information Act and considerations of what kind of information, including if you're talking about something that is law enforcement related, can be revealed and how it is to be revealed and what precludes something from being revealed. 20 years before, the actual protections of the Freedom of Information Act were substantially more substantive and more in the favor of the constitutional rights of the citizen or the person involved and the person that needed information to protect themselves and to be secure in their own person. Then 20 years later, when there is some determination regarding state secret and superior knowledge. And see, the ironic thing is during these processes of torture that began in 2008, part of it was about this acknowledgement of a superior, including in a manner that for someone like me who was studying martial art at the time could have one implication, but without acknowledgement of a verifiable chain of command, then this brings into question all kinds of other matters related to, well, who is it that is attempting, without identifying themselves and verifying who they are, who is it that is attempting to establish a claim as a superior and then expects for you to just respond to a command without knowing where it's coming from? And without having any justification for or substantiation of the justification for doing it. And this has been going on nonstop in some manner. For me specifically, since around the late October, early November 2008. Now, when I was on drugs, when I was on psychotropic medication, those command sequences were completely sublimated. I didn't have any analytical thinking. I didn't engage in any sort of analytical thinking once I had normalized to the medication. At some point, I attempted to volunteer at a community-based newspaper because I wanted to try to recreate my skills in being able to investigate and write and record. And so I started volunteering to be a journalist at a community newspaper in San Francisco. But the first couple of articles were absolutely excruciating. I had to teach myself how to hear information and process information and then write it in what I understood to be an appropriate reporting structure for presentation of information. It was excruciating. The first 2 to 3 articles I wrote, I was in actual physical pain. There were a number of other concurrent processes and messaging streams that were happening that were almost competing for insertion into the article. So I had to train myself again in backing it up with what I had written down as notes and or cross-referencing it with what I understood to be a fact of the actual event that I had been either interviewing somebody on or based upon my observations or based upon the information that was presented. There was all of these things. It was trying to contrive to have some sort of representation that I could not verify as fact. And in the course of doing that, I did understand that there were things that had happened earlier when I was a journalist that at the time were not factually correct third dimensionally, but I remember all of them. And see, this is the thing. Anything I said that I did not at the time have the evidence to back up third dimensionally, I remember it all. But at the time, it was understood. What I believe was happening is that somebody had a concurrent process where there were layers. And in the underwriting on whatever was going on in the literal moment were connected streams where other information was processing. And so, on one hand, in the literal third dimensional actual event that I was recording or reflecting, that literally did not happen. There were things that literally did not happen. I believe I remember all of those things because I made a point in my mind. I said, there's a reason why this isn't resonating as true. This is something I've been doing ever since I was 17 years old. And because I come from a family that was identified as being people that were delusional. The women in my family never told the truth. And so if I felt I was in a situation where I had to lie or I had to do something that wasn't about telling the truth, I made a note to myself, always remember this. There's a reason why. This isn't just about being crazy. So I remember whatever would have been presented in third dimensional information or what would have been presented as fact or as a journalistic project that may not have been factually correct in a verifiable manner at the time. I'm going to tell you right now, I believe every single one of them can be substantiated. That there were concurrent processes and there were also futures that were being constructed on what was allowed to be revealed as information at the time that ended up following, literally, the timeline. Literally. They were using it on one level of information that was publicly accessible in connection with events that were being done somewhere else in isolation and under some cloak of secrecy. And they were using the third dimensional event at the time as a form of outlay to later materialize the elements of the information that was presented concurrently, but may not have been third dimensionally linearly true at the moment. So then the question becomes the cognizability of the people that are presenting the information that they are presenting, including me, right? And so now we're in this situation where we're dealing with these layers of information. Now, I may have had a particular way of seeing this because my father was who he was, and I'm not going to talk about that right now, but I do understand that things I already know, that things that my father was involved in were either intentionally created or were allowed to be manipulated in order to facilitate acts of torture of other people, as well as me, and as well as members of my family. And the processes whereby that came about have been attempted for someone else's acquisition and normalization into an effort to try to legitimize it. And if you attenuate it, well, that pain doesn't hurt as much. And it might even stimulate you. And you can become addicted to it. And so in your addiction, you become conditioned to behaving in the manner that allows for you to get that positive, affirmative, pleasurable stimulation. You like that tone of voice. You like the way your face looks. You like that better than what it means to struggle to disengage the programming that's presenting an actual false narrative that you're supposed to take as your prescription and you're supposed to go in the world with. And you've been isolated from people for so long. And why don't you just shut up and do what they've programmed you to do? Why don't you just say what they say to say? Because at some point, what ends up happening is the degeneration, I believe, the degeneration and deterioration gets too severe. And so now what I believe has happened is that they literally tortured people to create certain kinds of product lines. And at a certain point, the contract terms out, and they just swap the contract with another company. So one company gets a period of time to take that product line and reverse engineer it while it creates its own product line. I've now lived through at least three different specific product line developments on specific kinds of techniques. And so I've been, as I understand, watching for the last year and a half while a specific kind of weaponization paradigm is unrolling. And the thing about it is now it is using a different kind of socio-political background as part of its development, and there is a different kind of political intent behind it, not only its development, but its purported implementation. And what has happened concurrently is that things that aren't necessarily directly connected to the intent to engage in a specific kind of weaponization scenario have aided and abetted its development and potential lethality, and effectiveness by virtue of absolute refusal to deal with crime as crime. When you make a civil claim for damages based on a structural flaw connected to a building that was made with substandard materials, and somebody's saying we got to actually look into what these substandard materials are, and then you just bury it for 10 years, that's what they did. That's exactly what they did. And in the course of being able to do what they intend to do with that, well, they had to have some things that were a carryover, or they pivoted long-term security deals and long-term deals they'd already invested in as a form of insurance in order to recalibrate that insurance to change the metrics. It wasn't 400, right? How many is it now? 400,000, right? I mean, do you want public school funding or not? It's literally where we are. Do you want your children to be able to go to school? Right? And so in the course of this, what they've also done is they've allowed for an effort to try to intentionally orchestrate this situation where we're supposed to relinquish what we had previously considered to be morally reprehensible, or what we had considered to be a violation of our ethos, either based upon our spiritual system or our religious system. And now they're creating and trying to promulgate an entire industry on ethics. These are the ethics of our company. These are the ethics of the, and in the meantime, it's like, well, wait a second. You've already made nuclear weapons paradigms out of most of what you have allowed to be surveilled and objectified of people's actual religious and spiritual systematologies. And I know there are some people who consider themselves to be people of faith, that believe it's completely within their faith tradition and completely commensurate with their understanding of spirituality and even religion, to use weapons, to develop weapons, to even use people that they consider to be heretics or the apostates in the development of those weapons, and to use those weapons on them. But in the course of that, the absorption of other people's spiritual belief systems into these weaponization components has done something. It's attempting to engineer us politically. After we've spent a whole weapons development eon being fundamentalized and radicalized in whatever we consider to be our spiritual belief system, which is exacerbated, at least in my case, by, that whole, old Feynman left over about isolation. Isolate her and subject her to tons and tons and tons of completely morally repulsive, repugnant, self-defeating images of anything that would have been potentially considered sacred. You've gone through the process of a rational materialist. You've been completely dispossessed of any sort of political praxis. All of your comrades and colleagues have either been killed or disappeared, or they've sold out, or they sold you, including in the most debasing levels. They literally expected you to be their whore of Babylon for the police pension system. You were their sacrifice. What are you going to do? Well, what do you have to reserve yourself with? What do you have to steal yourself with? Well, you get into spirituality. But we've had an eon now where people's spiritual systems, including their actual worship rituals, have been surveilled. Why? Well, do you want that gunman to come into your church and shoot it up? No, we need metal detectors. We need security cameras. We need security companies. And they've had an entire eon of weapons development paradigms specifically based on observation of people in ritual. While we've also had desecration of religious sites in order to alter dynamics energetically, globally, even cosmically. And so our spiritual belief systems have been created and recreated as a kind of perversity. And now we have the emergence of the sector for ethicists. We are beyond religious fundamentalism. We are capable of operating in a variety of spheres. We are multicultural. We are sensitive to your spiritual and faith traditions and where you come from culturally. If you exhibit a certain characteristic of a cultural paradigmatic historicity, then we can understand how we can pair that with another concept of something in order to create a sort of middle ground, an ethic. And so that's the new industry. So who right now is working on ethical plasma weapons development? Who is going to be the pioneering technologist when it comes to ethical use of plasma weapons. Because this, right now, is probably the hottest job market that they're just not talking about, right? Because you don't really talk about how hot your job is until after you get it. And I use hot intentionally because it's literally at that level, right? Now, I have up right now notes, and I'll finish it off with this, from a symposium on communist brainwashing. This was recorded and was put on the radio at the time, but it was also a live presentation of a number of people discussing what they alleged was communist brainwashing that was being committed at prison camps or military internment camps in communist China and the Soviet Union. It's dated for November 7th of 1957. I actually ended up reviewing this after I had been kidnapped for 10 days, again, kidnapped, in March of 2017, and subjected to a specific area and a specific mannerism of beta testing of not only certain kinds of energy weapons, as well as what is going on right now, but also a form of social political engineering that correlated with somebody's very extensive financial hedging portfolio. As a matter of fact, I believe there were already options that they executed in my kidnapping, including in who they contrived to have kidnapped with me. And they set up a whole systematology based on those 10 days, and it's been playing out ever since. My efforts at due process, many of them, I understand, somebody else took as what they want to masquerade as their strategy for, well, I've been saying, and I understand. I know how you could take my legal filings and make a weapon out of them. I also know that the intent to use them as a weapon, well, let's just say I have not confirmed by actually doing what the next stage would be in order for me to use them as a weapon. It's kind of like they've created me as a gun that's not loaded. And if you cut me off, me, the maker of the gun, you can take the gun out and maybe you can get the bullets from someone else. And that's exactly what they've been doing. That's exactly what they set me and my capabilities up to be without any consent and without anything close to an actual justification. The truth of the matter is, I don't even see the strategic sense in allowing for the entirety of your society to be orchestrated into this paradigm. It doesn't make any rational sense. It's delusional. It's purely a gamesmanship based upon how much you can compel other people to succumb to your sadism. Now, even in the rules, even in the ways of a sadist, there are supposed to be rules. There's supposed to be some way to hold even a sadist accountable. And we're in a very, very, very dangerous place right now. And we're also at a very, very poor place because nobody's willing to do that. Nobody's willing to demonstrate enough self-discipline in order to hold the competing sadists accountable. And that's unfortunately where we are. I wish that this had gone differently. I hope that this satisfies the requirements for this time frame. I believe my time is up. I have a little under 7 minutes. I yield those 7 minutes to the gentleman or lady after me.